Poverty in Ukraine, controversy or truth? One of the most common questions I get either here on YouTube or when I'm talking to people in person is this: why is Ukraine poor? What's the source of this poverty? To answer this question, I'm going to share some real data. This is information that anyone can research, independently verify, and I'm going to tell you a real life story about a family that I've met living in poverty. Hello everyone, my name is Faith Woods from Mission Partners, and this video is a follow-up to my first video about poverty in Ukraine. Some of our viewers have commented and asked very thoughtful questions about Ukraine and why there's poverty in Ukraine at all. After all, they've had freedom from communism for 25 years. They're known for having fertile soil, they could grow a lot of food. So, what's the deal, right? Why is Ukraine one of the poorest countries in Europe? I've called this controversy or truth because many people don't even understand poverty in Eastern Europe at all. They don't know why there's poverty there, and some have just plain disagreed with me, saying that I must be exaggerating. I think if I were talking about Africa or maybe Haiti, no one would question me. But Ukraine? If you're one of those people, just hang tight and I'll explain what I've personally seen and actually experienced myself. So, when I explain that people in Ukraine are poor, I want you to know that I'm not just some Westerner making up a good story so that I can get views on YouTube. This information relies on our organization's 20+ years experience working in Ukraine as a humanitarian agency, plus my own personal experience, meeting people, traveling around the country of Ukraine myself. We've been on the ground in Ukraine since the Soviet Union fell apart, and we're still there fighting to release people from poverty. So for those of you who like the hard facts, I'm going to give you six major reasons for the continued economic decline and the widespread growing poverty in Ukraine. But before I start to outline, those reasons behind why Ukraine is still struggling so much, I thought maybe I would tell you a story. After all, sometimes it's better to show than to tell, right? So let me take you on a little trip, maybe to see some of what I've seen with my own eyes. In a few moments, I'm going to introduce you to this beautiful young lady and her family. Her name is Ruslana. But first, let's just back up a minute. This is the tiny village of Stepove. This village is challenging to find even on a map. But about 3 years ago, we were traveling with a faithful group of volunteers that just happened to have a heart to help children and families in crisis in this group of villages. There's lots of villages around Ukraine just like this one. I know because I've seen them and because I have good friends who live there. If you were to travel to Stepove with us, the first thing that you'd probably notice is the narrow dirt roads riddled with potholes. This is not a gravel road, it's just plain dirt. The next thing you'd likely notice is the houses along this dirt pathway, only they would look nothing like houses that you might see in smaller rural communities in North America. Some are in better condition than others, but many, even from a distance, look kind of run down. Now, it's not a shanty town in Haiti, but it's still far below the lowest housing standards that you've experienced in smaller communities that you may have visited in North America. Almost every yard looks like it has a small vegetable garden, and you wonder to yourself, why? Maybe you think about small villages here in Canada or the US or other parts of the West. Do they all have gardens? Well, obviously not. So either here everyone has a green thumb and just loves growing things, or it's about sheer survival. Nothing grown is potentially nothing to eat. So let's take a closer look at the homes in this village, shall we? So this is what I see when I travel to Ukraine. We've begun to focus a great deal of our efforts in the smaller towns and villages around Ukraine. Why? Because there's simply more people who struggle there. Most of the employment opportunities in Ukraine are actually in the cities, especially in the capital city of Kiev. There are other poverty issues within the cities, and we do help people there as well. But we really want to be where the greatest needs are. So before I continue my story and introduce you to Ruslana and her family, let's start with some just baseline poverty numbers for those of you who like those details. One question I've been asked about is the Ukrainian economy and their industry and employment opportunities, things like that. So the GDP of Ukraine, for those of you who aren't economists, GDP just means the total of all the goods and services produced within the country. This is generally understood worldwide to be a measure of a country's economic health. So in Ukraine, their GDP per capita, per thousand people in 2019, before the pandemic, mind you, it was $12,810 US. That sounds like a lot, right? But let's compare it to other European countries. Poland, for example, their GDP in 2019 was over $33,000 US. That's more than double. Germany, it was almost $54,000. That's more than quadruple that of Ukraine. So overall, the economy in Ukraine was suffering even before 2020. What about income levels? So let's compare Switzerland. That's a fairly wealthy European nation. Cost of goods also are very high in Switzerland, but let's say we adjust income to living costs. That means we take into account the fact that goods are much less expensive to purchase in Ukraine. So if we do that, and then we average out all the higher incomes with the lower incomes, in Switzerland, their average income is 4,200 euros a month. In Ukraine, it's only 900. So in Switzerland, that's 4 times as much income on average. And honestly, I have to say from my personal experience, the only reason that we could put $900 euro a month income in Ukraine is, number one, their goods are a lot lower, so we've actually adjusted that number higher. And number two, the income discrepancy between people working in the city, maybe for a foreign agency, and those who live in the villages, that's huge. That's a huge spectrum. And the people in that lower range, there's millions and millions of those. Now, I want you to understand that in no way am I looking down on Ukrainians or degrading the Ukrainian people or undermining their dignity as a people. I have many good friends who are Ukrainian, who live in Ukraine, and it's my love for them and for the nation of Ukraine. That's why I'm there at all. I know people are suffering. I've met them. I've seen them with my own eyes. And all I want to do is help. Bring healing and hope to those who genuinely do suffer. And as long as there's even a tiny percentage of those people within Ukraine, we will be there. So, reason number one. One of the sources of this poverty is something that might be a little controversial to talk about, but it's very important. That's corruption. Since the end of communism, there have been people in power in Ukraine, powerful leaders, not just government leaders. These are the oligarchs, a small group of people who have an iron-fisted control over national policy and economic development. They're not primarily interested in what's good for Ukraine or Ukrainians. They are more interested in their own pocketbooks and their own private purposes. This is self-interested power, and it comes at the expense of the economy of the country and definitely the benefit of the people. Because of this, there's actually a profound lack of trust in their public institutions. People don't believe in their government. There was an entire revolution in 2014 because of this. Maybe you've heard about it. So the question is, has it been better since 2014? Maybe, but they still have a long way to go. Ukraine will have great difficulty growing its economy if the people can't trust their public institutions. Because for an economy to grow and a workforce to be competitive, the country's people have to work within the system. Although there's great opportunity for growth in Ukraine, there's no doubt about that. They do have wonderful land for agriculture, for example, and many people that could contribute. They could have a major export being agriculture, but attempts to modernize their equipment and their technology so that they could be competitive on an international marketplace, it's actually been held back by the oligarchy. Reason number two, another major issue in place since 2014 is war. A lot of resources nationally have been diverted into supporting the efforts of the Ukrainian army, who's trying to keep the peace and maintain border integrity on the eastern part of their country, the Donbass. This has caused so many problems throughout the country, not just in the east. But for those of the people who actually live in the east still, they have unstable, unreliable infrastructure, and depending on how close they are to the separatist border, you have to worry about shelling, fighting. It's right on your doorstep. That's no way to live. It certainly doesn't contribute to health or wealth. So we send aid out to the east regularly because there are so many people that live there that are in desperate need. Our partners travel back and forth to the east all the time, bringing food, blankets, other kinds of aid to many. After one of the recent trips, we were talking to the driver, Victor. Usually he just goes along to drive, but amongst all the other deliveries and visits, he always visits this one family that has 7 children. He explained to us, his last experience. This is Natasha and Max. They have 7 kids, and he takes food, blankets, whatever he can get his hands on, and they happened to be at dinner the last time he was there. And he noticed that the kids were so hungry after they finished their meal that they licked their plates clean. There's no leftovers, and they still seemed hungry afterward. Many people obviously left the east, which meant the rest of the country's been dealing with refugees. And I pray to God that most of them have found jobs by now, but I also know that many really had nowhere to go. No family, they couldn't find work, so they ended up on the streets of the capital and other cities. Reason number 3. This brings me to healthcare. I don't know where you're from. I live in Canada. So we have a very robust and free healthcare system here in Canada. It's not perfect, but we rely on being able to get surgeries or seen by our family doctor without worrying about a bill that we can't afford to pay. If you happen to be in the US, likely you rely on health insurance of some kind to get your medical care, but I believe that most people in the States can afford to pay for decent health insurance, and they can rely on good quality care when they need it. That's not the case in Ukraine. For the most part, healthcare is paid by the patient. The hospital itself is operated by the government. They pay for electricity and minimal staff wages and things like that. But if you need a surgery, you have to pay for it. If you need medicine while you're staying at the hospital, guess what? You have to bring it. You have to pay for it. A couple of years ago, I met a blind man living in a small community named Gogolev, just outside of Kiev. And in addition to being blind, he also has type 1 diabetes. And the family couldn't afford a regular insulin supply for this man. And unfortunately, I heard just a couple of weeks ago that he now has serious heart problems and he needs a very expensive surgery, thousands of US dollars, but they can't afford it. And especially in the last year, I know a lot of friends of mine who were just terrified to be sent to a rural hospital in Ukraine because their equipment is so outdated and they know that the care they'll get is substandard. These are hospitals that have no oxygen, no ventilators, no other kinds of standard equipment that you'd expect in a modern hospital. Reason number 4. If you're a pensioner, for example, average pensions are much, much lower than that €900 average wage that I mentioned earlier. And so there's just no way that they can afford both food and sufficient health care. If you want to eat, that's pretty important. So you have to make tough choices. And it's also challenging to pay for heating your apartment, for example. You have to remember that the climate in Ukraine is cold, not like some of the, Caribbean countries. You have to have heat of some kind. But I've heard story after story of people keeping their heat very, very low or even turned off so that they can save money for food. Reason number 5, perhaps the most important point I can highlight, is mostly a cultural mindset of many Ukrainians, not all. Again, please understand, I don't mean any disrespect, but I believe there is among many a systemic poverty mindset that seems to be stubborn and very difficult to get past. I read an article recently done by a group of Ukrainian economists called Vox Ukraine. Their study included a survey of actual Ukrainian people from different demographics, different backgrounds. They weren't city dwellers, and it was a very small group of people, but it is interesting. You can find details of this study online if you want to go look it up. These were some of their key findings. Most of the people dreamt about having a good, stable, high-paying, long-term job. But in practice, what they sought out was intermittent work. I need money, so I'll go do a few days work here and a few days work there. In practice, there was really very little motivation to work hard to find a better job. And most of those surveyed really had little understanding of what their job responsibility was, and their productivity was low. Most people were somewhat financially illiterate, meaning they'd never been taught or even understood the concept of saving, investing. If they had more money, they spent it. Many blamed unemployment simply on the loss of Soviet factories, and most of them viewed rich people with suspicion, believing them to be disrespectful people who gained their money through dishonesty. Reason number 6. If you're a child born into a small, poor village, there are simply fewer opportunities to escape and have a chance at your future. Believing in your future feels next to impossible, so why try? The belief that you can't hope for better than what you see around you becomes so ingrained in people's minds. Add to that a lack of trust in the people who should be there helping you, and you get a long-term poverty mindset. I know from conversations that I've had with people working in these villages that things like parental neglect, substance abuse, unemployment, poor nutrition, early sexual activity, teen pregnancy, these are the things that they fight against constantly in these villages. Without intervention, even educational opportunities, they're limited. They're limited for these kids, even though they all hope and dream just like any other child does. Eventually, life kind of beats them down until they have the same lack of expectation as their parents live with every day. So let's get back to the village of Stepove, shall we? There are very few employment opportunities in this village itself. That's to be expected. It is a very small village. Local officials don't allow land privatization, so you can't buy extra land to have an extra, garden or farm where you can grow things to sell. That holds them back. Let's get back to Ruslana and her family. This is their home. Ruslana loves to study music and literature. She likes singing and painting. She wants to be a television news anchor. Big dreams. But instead, this is her reality. The family's diet has no meat at all. They survive on a few vegetables, potatoes, and bread. Exclusively, that's all they have. Dad works sometimes. He has seasonal work. And actually, I've never seen Dad. All the pictures I've seen, and every time I've been there, they only have Mom and the kids. Mom stays home. She looks after the family cow. They do sell a little bit of milk from the cow to get some extra money. The family heats their home with wood, and for that they have to scavenge in the forest to find it. Even then, they can't heat their home consistently and eat too. They just can't afford to. Ruslana's mom struggles greatly with alcohol. Despite, counseling, life has pushed her down so much that sometimes she just feels desperate and she turns to what she knows, which is alcohol. Schooling isn't completely free for children, so it's very challenging to succeed in your education. And without better opportunities or better employment for mom or dad or some intervention from people who care, funding, help of some kind, Ruslana's just starting off with a host of disadvantages stacked against her. She's in a deficit position through no fault of her own. Again, speaking from years of experience, quite honestly, the best opportunities in Ukraine to hope for a decent job is this. Number 1, learn to speak English fluently. Number 2, learn how to work hard. Number 3, move to the city and get a job with a foreign agency doing business in Ukraine. Success isn't impossible for anyone. It's just more difficult for some. But that's why we're there, to help families just like this one, to counsel them, to show them hope, to show them that there could be something better. That's exactly what we're doing. We are fighting against many forms and sources of poverty in Ukraine, physical, emotional, spiritual, with whatever tools that we have, from emergency food, heating support, direct child sponsorship, educational and English tutoring investments. We're even supplying tools that will support sustainable agriculture for families and for communities. These are all done in partnership with local churches, local leaders. These are the people who know their communities well, and they're motivated to make a difference for their neighbors, for the people they live right beside. Our singular goal is to help families and communities become healthier, more hopeful, more connected, more self-sufficient in the long term. You can subscribe to our channel to hear more from us about fighting poverty in Ukraine and in Belarus, where we also work. And if you want to learn more about Mission Partners and how we fight against poverty in these countries, you can visit our website at mpiconnect.org. You can subscribe to our e-newsletter right there. You can also check us out on Facebook and on Instagram. Remember, keep fighting with us against poverty of all kinds in Ukraine. Thanks for watching. See you next time.